The laughter still echoes in my mind. That sound, bright, careless, cruel, was the last thing I heard before everything shattered. My son Daniel was standing on the edge of the Harper family's pier, his breath visible in the crisp November air, when Richard Harper said, "Let's see how tough our engineer boy really is." Then came the shove, the splash, and the silence. He hit the wooden post with a dull thud that made my heart stop. The lake swallowed him whole. They all stood there, Olivia, her father, her brothers, watching. I screamed, my voice tearing through the cold air. "Call 911, he's not moving," but they only laughed. "Oh, come on, Mrs. Cole, he can swim," one of them called out. When the ambulance finally arrived, my hands were numb, my voice hollow. I dialed the one number I hadn't touched in 10 years, and whispered, "Noah. They're heading home now. Do what you have to do." That was the moment I stopped being just a mother and became something else entirely. The day had begun deceptively peaceful. Blue Ridge Lake shimmered beneath the pale Georgia sun, its glassy surface broken only by drifting leaves and the reflection of the sprawling Harper estate. The mansion stood proudly on the hillside, all dark timber and glittering glass, surrounded by manicured lawns that looked too perfect to belong to real people. I had never liked that house. It was beautiful in the way a snake's skin is beautiful, polished, cold, and hiding something deadly underneath. I came only because Olivia insisted. "Dad's throwing a small family lunch," she'd said sweetly over the phone. "He wants to make things right." But her tone carried that polished politeness I'd learned to fear. When I arrived, the lake breeze bit through my coat. Laughter drifted from the patio, where long tables had been set up with crystal glasses and perfectly folded napkins. I stood at a distance unnoticed at first, watching the family that had become my son's burden. Richard Harper, 60, silver-haired, radiating arrogance, sat at the head of the table, whiskey in hand. His wife Veronica wore pearls so large they seemed to choke her. Olivia fluttered between them, hosting, laughing, her golden hair catching the light. My son sat quietly beside her, polite, smiling when spoken to, his posture stiff. He had always been gentle, thoughtful. He wasn't built for their games. "Mrs. Cole, so good you could make it," Richard said when he finally noticed me. His tone was thick with southern courtesy, the kind that slices deeper than open hostility. "We were just talking about Daniel's latest project, something about water treatment." He turned to Daniel with mock interest. "Tell us, son, how does one make a living saving puddles?" Daniel's smile faltered. "It's a restoration project, sir. For the river basin." "Admirable," Richard said, raising his glass. "Though a bit modest compared to real business." The others chuckled. Even Olivia looked away, pretending to be busy refilling glasses. I sat at the far end of the table, my tea untouched, each word they threw like a pebble dropped into my chest. Lunch stretched on painfully. They talked about markets and land deals, occasionally pausing to correct Daniel's modest ambitions. The more they drank, the louder the laughter became. I tried to focus on the lake beyond the glass railing. The water looked so calm, but I felt a strange tension in the air, a heaviness that made me tighten my coat. After the meal, Richard stood, his cheeks flushed. "Well, folks, the day's too fine to waste inside. Let's have a little fun down by the dock." Olivia clapped her hands. "Perfect, the light's beautiful. I can get some video for social media." Daniel hesitated. "Dad, maybe later. Come now," Richard interrupted, clapping a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You've been cooped up in that office too long. A quick dip never hurt anyone." I felt the dread before I understood it. "Richard," I said quietly, "it's November. The water's freezing." He grinned. All the better to toughen him up. Ethan, Olivia's younger brother, joined in, half drunk and smirking. "Yeah, Mama Cole, don't worry. We'll make a man out of him today." Their laughter bounced off the water, brittle and sharp. Daniel tried to laugh too, his voice strained. "I think I'll pass. Maybe next time." "Oh, come on, sweetheart," Olivia said, lifting her phone to record. "Show them you're not afraid of a little water." I stood my chair, scraping the deck. "Enough. This isn't funny." No one heard me or pretended not to. Richard led the group down the wooden steps toward the pier. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of pine and cold metal. Daniel followed, his shoulders hunched, and I went after them, heart pounding. "Dad, please," Daniel began, but Richard was already at the edge of the dock, grinning like a boy with a cruel secret. "Let's see if that river-saving body can handle a little lake water," he said. Then to Ethan, "Help me out." They cornered him playfully, or at least that's how it started. Laughter again. A shove. Another. Daniel stumbled back, his foot slipping on the wet wood. He caught himself, but Ethan gave one last push, harder than he intended maybe, but not by accident. The sound when he hit the post was soft but final. The wooden beam cracked against his skull, and then there was just water. My scream tore through the air. "Daniel!" For a heartbeat, no one moved. The lake rippled calm again. Then a few bubbles surfaced, small, pitiful. "Get him out!" I shouted, running toward the edge. "He's hurt." Ethan looked uncertain, glancing at his father. Richard just smirked, lighting a cigar. "Relax, Eleanor. He's a strong boy." "Richard, he's not moving." He exhaled smoke. "Stop being dramatic. He can swim." I didn't think. I kicked off my shoes and dove in. The cold hit like a wall of knives. My breath vanished. I opened my eyes underwater. Everything was murky, green, and gray. Somewhere below, a shape drifted motionless. My hands found fabric, his jacket sleeve. I pulled with everything I had. The weight was unbearable, my lungs burning, but somehow I broke the surface, gasping. "Help me!" I screamed again, dragging Daniel toward the dock. "He's bleeding." No one moved. Olivia stood frozen, her phone trembling in her hand. Ethan muttered, "Oh God," but Richard's voice cut him off. "Let her handle it. Maybe she'll finally learn what real struggle feels like." I wanted to kill him. But there was only water and my son's pale face. A man's voice shouted from across the shore. A fisherman dropped his rod and jumped into his boat. He started the motor, rushing toward us. I clung to Daniel, shivering, whispering his name over and over. By the time the fisherman reached us, Daniel's lips were blue. The man hauled him into the boat and began CPR. His movements desperate but sure. "He's got a pulse," he yelled. I sobbed, half in relief, half in fury. When the ambulance lights finally flared in the distance, the Harpers were gone. Their black SUV had disappeared down the long drive, leaving only tire marks in the gravel. I climbed onto the dock, my clothes heavy, my hands trembling. The paramedics took over. One asked, "Ma'am, did he fall?" I looked toward the road where the SUV had vanished and said, voice steady, "No. He was pushed." The medic nodded grimly and turned back to his work. I stood there, water dripping from my hair, the lake calm once more, as if it hadn't just tried to swallow my life whole. When they loaded Daniel into the ambulance, I followed in silence. My phone felt heavy in my pocket. I pulled it out, stared at the screen, and scrolled to a name I hadn't seen in a decade. Noah Cole. My brother's number. The last time I'd called him, we had screamed at each other about right and wrong, about the cost of justice. I had begged him to stop exposing powerful men before he destroyed himself. He had laughed and said, "One day you'll need my kind of justice." That day had come. The call connected. A deep voice answered, wary. "Who is this?" "It's me," I whispered, glancing at the paramedics working over my son. Silence. Then his tone changed, low and sharp. "What happened?" "They tried to kill him." A pause. I could almost hear his breath steadying, the gears turning. "They're heading home now," I said. "Do what you have to do." I hung up before he could reply. The ambulance doors closed. Blue lights flickered against the lake's surface, painting the water the same color as his eyes. And as the siren wailed into the distance, I sat beside my son, soaked, shivering but calm, calm like the lake after the storm, calm like someone who finally understood that justice wasn't coming, justice had to be made. The hospital smelled of bleach and rain. I sat in the waiting room, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, my hair still damp, my hands trembling. The clock on the wall ticked too loud. Nurses passed by, their shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor, faces calm, voices professional. In that stillness, I realized how alone I was. Olivia stood across the room, scrolling on her phone, her face lit by the pale glow of the screen. Her mother Veronica sat beside her complaining softly about the cold coffee. When the doctor approached, I stood up so quickly my knees cracked. "He's stable," the doctor said, eyes moving between us. "There's a concussion and some hypothermia. We'll need to monitor him closely." Olivia's voice came out sharp, almost irritated. "So he'll be fine, right?" The doctor hesitated. "It's too early to say." Veronica huffed. "He's young. He'll bounce back." I stared at them both, unable to believe the calmness in their tone. The doctor nodded politely and left. Olivia turned toward me with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You see, Mrs. Cole, no need for the dramatics. Daniel's always been a bit fragile." I felt my fingers curl against my blanket. He hit his head on a wooden post. "That's not fragile, that's physics." Her smile flickered. "Let's just not make this into something ugly, okay? The press doesn't need to hear about an accident." "Dad's company is already under pressure." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I watched as she adjusted her coat and walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking like metronomes of indifference. The night stretched on endlessly. Outside rain tapped the windows in soft, relentless rhythms. I stared at the door of Daniel's room and remembered another night years ago, the night everything had started to break. It was the first time I met the Harpers. Daniel had invited me to dinner at a restaurant in downtown Atlanta, nervous and proud. "Mom," he'd said, "they're a little formal, but nice." Formal was an understatement. Richard Harper had shaken my hand as if testing my grip. His wife had smiled in that perfect unblinking way of women who've learned to smile through contempt. Olivia had been glowing back then, sweet, charming, calling me Mom after the second glass of wine. Richard had leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink. "So, Mrs. Cole, you're a teacher?" "Yes, sir. Retired now." "A noble profession," he said, eyes scanning the menu, "though I imagine not a lucrative one." Olivia giggled softly, and Daniel's hand twitched under the table. I smiled politely. "Wealth isn't the only kind of success." Richard raised his glass. "True. But it does help buy the other kinds." I remember thinking that night how loud the clinking of glass could sound when it's hiding cruelty. After the wedding, things changed faster than I'd expected. Daniel moved into the Harper estate. Olivia said it made sense financially. I visited once a month, always leaving with the same tightness in my chest. They called Daniel the project, teased him about his job, his clothes, even the way he spoke. When I tried to defend him, Richard would grin and say, "You raised a sensitive man, Eleanor. That's rare these days." I thought sensitivity was a virtue. In their world, it was a weakness. Now sitting in that sterile hospital corridor, I understood what my silence had cost. Every laugh I'd ignored, every insult I'd brushed off, every visit I'd cut short, they had built the road that led us here. A nurse approached quietly. "Mrs. Cole, you can see him now." Daniel lay pale beneath white sheets, a bandage wrapped around his head, an IV line trailing down his arm. Machines blinked softly beside him, steady and indifferent. I took his hand. It was cold, but it moved faintly when I squeezed. "Mom," he murmured, eyes barely open. "I'm here," I whispered. "Don't talk." His lips trembled. "Did they?" "Shh," I said, brushing his hair back. "Save your strength." He closed his eyes again and I sat there listening to the rhythm of his breathing. For the first time in years I didn't feel small. I felt something sharper, heavier, a clarity born from pain. Hours passed. I watched shadows crawl across the floor as dawn approached. Olivia hadn't returned. Richard hadn't called. Only the hum of machines and the scent of disinfectant kept me company. At sunrise, I went to the small hospital cafeteria. The woman at the counter gave me coffee and a sympathetic smile. "Family trouble?" she asked. I hesitated. "Something like that." Back in the waiting area, I found Olivia again. Her makeup was perfect, her hair freshly brushed. She looked as if she'd come straight from a photo shoot. "I spoke to Dad," she said. "He wants to know if you've told anyone what happened." "I told the police officer on duty," I said evenly. Her eyes widened. "You what?" "It was an assault." I told the truth. She sighed dramatically. "You're making this worse for everyone. Dad says you don't understand how these things work. Accidents happen. You need to let it go." I looked at her for a long moment. Your father taught you well. What's that supposed to mean? That you can dress cruelty in manners and call it civilization? She rolled her eyes. You always overthink everything. I stood, my knees stiff. No, I've just lived long enough to recognize evil when it smiles at me. For the first time, she had no response. She simply turned and left. That afternoon, while Daniel slept, I walked outside into the hospital courtyard. The sun had broken through, the clouds gleaming off the wet pavement. Pigeons pecked near a bench where an old man read a newspaper. I sat down, closing my eyes for a moment. I thought about the Harper house, their glass walls, their perfect lawn, the way it all reflected light, without ever letting any warmth through. It was an empire of glass, I realized. Beautiful, transparent, but ready to shatter at the slightest touch. When I opened my eyes, a janitor was sweeping nearby, humming softly to himself. The air smelled faintly of pine and rain. For the first time since the lake, I took a full breath. The glass empire would break. Maybe not today, but soon. Inside, a nurse found me near the elevators. Your son's condition is improving, she said. He's responding well. Thank you, I said quietly, pressing my hand to my chest. As I returned to the room, I paused at the window overlooking the parking lot. The reflection of the sun on the hospital glass nearly blinded me. It looked just like the water at Blue Ridge, bright, calm, deceptive. I could almost see Richard Harper's smirk in the glare. I whispered to the glass, "Enjoy your calm, Richard. Storms always come back." Back inside, Daniel stirred. I sat beside him again, smoothing the blanket over his chest. You're safe now, I murmured, even though safety was a lie I couldn't yet give him. When the doctor came for evening rounds, I listened carefully to every word, asking questions Olivia never bothered to ask. The staff had started to look at me differently now, not as the hysterical woman from the night before, but as someone anchored, precise, dangerous in her calm. As night settled again, I pulled out my phone. My brother's last message from years ago still sat there. When the world stops listening, call me. I didn't write him yet. I didn't need to. I knew he was already listening. Through the window, I could see the horizon glowing faintly. It wasn't sunrise yet, but something was shifting in me, a quiet certainty. The Harpers thought they could break my son and bury the evidence beneath money and charm. They didn't know the soil they stood on had already cracked. I looked down at Daniel, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. His heartbeat beeped steadily on the monitor, a soft rhythm of survival. I leaned closer, whispering into the sterile air, "They think they ended something. But they just woke me up." The night after Daniel woke for the first time, I sat beside his bed watching the monitors glow green in the dark. Every beep sounded like a whisper of hope, steady and defiant. Outside, the rain had turned into snow, thin flakes drifting against the hospital window. I rested my palm on his hand, the same hand that used to hold a pencil awkwardly when he was a boy. He stirred half-conscious, and I heard him murmur, "Mom, I'm here, sweetheart," I said softly. "Go back to sleep." His eyes fluttered shut again, and I stared at his face, pale but peaceful. For years I had prayed for peace like this. But peace had never come without a price. When he was 10, the day we buried his father, I remember thinking that I would never see sunlight the same way again. The funeral was quiet, small. He had been a construction worker, a careful man, who fell victim to someone else's negligence. One broken beam, one wrong calculation. The company paid a settlement and sent flowers. I didn't take the money. I took a job teaching extra classes instead, walking home after dark, hands stiff with chalk dust. Daniel was a quiet child. He would wait for me at the school gate with a thermos of tea, and that hopeful smile that always made me forget how tired I was. He would say, "It's okay, Mom, we can heat leftovers," and he'd make me sit down first when we ate. Even then, he was older than his years, soft-spoken, serious, wanting to protect me. I suppose that was his first mistake. When he met Olivia Harper, he told me she was different. "She's kind, Mom," he'd said. "She understands me." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to see him happy. When she came to visit our small apartment, she brought wine and expensive perfume that filled the room like fog. She was charming, confident, everything my Daniel wasn't. I watched the way she placed her hand on his arm, not affectionately, but like she was claiming something. After they married, he called less often. He said it was work, that he was busy helping Richard Harper's company with environmental audits. I told him how proud I was even when I heard the fatigue in his voice. When I visited the Harper estate, Olivia would greet me at the door in her tailored dresses, smiling too brightly. "You know how busy Daniel is, Mrs. Cole," she'd say, glancing past me as if my presence cluttered the house. Richard would appear behind her, all charm and dominance, offering wine and subtle insults wrapped in compliments. A teacher, yes, that must be fulfilling though surely demanding. I would smile, nod, and sit at their long marble table, feeling smaller with every word. Each visit ended the same way, me walking to the car under the glow of their security lights, whispering to myself that Daniel was happy, that love was enough. But love can turn into a cage when the door is built from someone else's approval. At the hospital, watching my son breathe through cracked lips, I realized how many years I had mistaken endurance for strength. I had endured their looks, their laughter, their cruelty disguised as family. I thought silence would keep Daniel safe. I thought humility was the answer. But humility only works in the presence of decency. Around predators, it's just blood in the water. The snow outside thickened. I sat back and closed my eyes, the hum of the heater soft in my ears. I thought about Noah, my brother. 10 years without a word between us. He had been the opposite of me, outspoken, relentless, a journalist who chased corruption like a hunter chasing wolves. He had once exposed a state senator tied to illegal land deals, and the price was his career. When I begged him to stop, he'd shouted, "You can't keep hiding behind politeness, Margie." I had told him he was obsessed. That justice and revenge were the same. He'd looked at me then with pity. "One day you'll understand the difference." Maybe that day had arrived. A nurse entered quietly, checking Daniel's IV. "He's improving," she said with a gentle smile. "You should rest." "I will," I said, though I didn't mean it. When she left, I opened my handbag and took out a small notebook I used to keep for lesson plans. Its cover was worn, the corners bent. I flipped to a blank page and wrote, "Things I kept silent about." Beneath it, I listed every insult, every time they'd made Daniel feel less than enough, every moment I had smiled to keep the peace. The list grew until my handwriting started to blur. At the bottom of the page, I wrote, "Silence can protect, but it can also destroy." My pen hovered over the paper. A memory surfaced, one of my last classes before I retired. I'd asked my students to write an essay about morality. A girl had written, "Goodness without courage is just decoration." I had underlined the sentence twice. When I returned home that night, I remember telling Daniel that wisdom sometimes came from the mouths of children. He'd laughed and said, "Then maybe you raised one." Now, sitting under hospital light, I finally understood what that meant. By morning, Daniel was awake. He looked at me, eyes red-rimmed but alert. "Mom, don't go back there," he said hoarsely. "Promise me." "I won't," I lied. "I thought if I tried harder they'd change," he murmured. "They never change, Daniel. They just grow bolder when you forgive them too easily." He looked away, silent. I reached for his hand again. "Rest," I said. "We'll talk later." He nodded and closed his eyes. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was pale gray, the kind that hides the sun but promises light. I went down to the hospital chapel. It was empty, smelling of wax and cedar. I lit a candle, my fingers trembling slightly. The small flame flickered and steadied its reflection, dancing on the brass holder. "I've done my part," I whispered. "Now I'll do what must be done." The words came easily, without guilt. When I stepped out, I saw Olivia in the hallway, arguing softly on her phone. "Dad, the press is still calling." "No," I told them, "it was an accident." Her voice trembled just a little. When she saw me, she hung up quickly and forced a smile. "He's awake, I heard." "That's good news." "Yes," I said, "it is." Her perfume reached me first, floral, artificial. She clasped her purse tighter. "I hope you're not still upset about the lake." "It was just a stupid game that went wrong." "Game," I repeated. Interesting word for attempted murder. She flushed, then laughed too loudly. "You're dramatic, Mrs. Cole." I stepped closer. "No, I'm awake." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Fear, recognition, I couldn't tell. She mumbled an excuse and hurried down the corridor. I watched her leave, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Not satisfaction, just purpose. The same calm that comes after a storm, when the air feels heavy with promise. When I returned to Daniel's room, he was sleeping again. I sat quietly watching his chest rise and fall. I reached into my bag and took out my phone. Noah's name still sat there in my contacts list, patient and waiting. I didn't press it yet, but I held my finger above the screen long enough to feel the weight of the choice. The candle's flame still burned in my mind, steady and small but unstoppable. Silence had carried me far, but it had carried me in circles. Now it was time to speak, not in words but in actions that couldn't be ignored. I leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair from Daniel's forehead. "Rest now," I whispered. "Your mother's got work to do." Outside, the clouds parted slightly, letting a shaft of sunlight spill through the hospital windows. It glinted off the polished floor, warm against my hands. The sound of distant footsteps echoed down the corridor, rhythmic and certain, like the beginning of something inevitable. The invitation arrived 3 days later, printed on heavy cream paper that smelled faintly of expensive cologne. "Family luncheon at Blue Ridge Lake House, private gathering." The handwriting was Richard Harper's, neat and forceful. At the bottom in smaller letters, Olivia had written, "Dad wants to make peace. Please come, Mom. Don't embarrass us." I read the words twice, then folded the card and slid it into my pocket. They wanted peace. Peace never followed blood. It only followed silence, and I was done being silent. On Sunday morning, the sky hung low with thick gray clouds, the kind that promised rain but hadn't decided yet. Daniel was still in the hospital, sleeping soundly under a nurse's watch. Before I left, I brushed a hand through his hair. "I'll be back soon," I whispered. "I just want to see something." His fingers twitched around mine as if he knew. The drive to Blue Ridge felt longer than it was. Pine trees lined the winding road, tall and watchful. When I turned into the Harper property, the security gates swung open as if expecting me. The mansion rose from the hillside like an accusation, walls of glass, sharp angles, nothing soft about it. The lake behind it stretched wide and steel-colored, perfectly still, perfectly deceptive. Veronica opened the door, her pearls gleaming against her throat. "Eleanor," she said, with a brittle smile, "so nice of you to come." "Olivia insisted," I said. "Yes, she's always trying to fix things." Her tone made fix sound like control. The dining room smelled of roasted meat and wine. Richard sat at the head of the table, a cigar resting in his ashtray. Olivia stood behind him, arranging plates, her voice bright, rehearsed. "Everyone, let's keep things civil today, please." Richard raised his glass. "Civil is my middle name," he said, then looked directly at me. "You look tired, Mrs. Cole." "Hospital nights, I imagine. Some of us have reasons to stay awake," I replied. The smile didn't leave his face, but his eyes hardened. Still holding on to that nonsense about an accident being something else, I sat down without answering. Olivia poured me a glass of water but didn't meet my gaze. Lunch began. Forks clinked. The conversation flowed like poisoned honey, light, charming, deadly. They spoke about the stock market, new developments in the city, Richard's new contract with a government housing board. When the talk turned to Daniel, my stomach tightened. "He'll recover," Richard said with false concern. "Doctors today work miracles." Though perhaps a little toughness would have kept him from this mess. Ethan, Olivia's younger brother, snickered. "Not everyone can handle a little cold water, Dad." Olivia's laugh was thin and nervous. "Stop, Ethan." I set my fork down carefully. Daniel doesn't need to prove toughness to anyone. Especially not to men who mistake cruelty for strength. The table fell silent. Richard leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You've got spirit, Eleanor. I'll give you that. But perhaps you should focus on your son's recovery rather than blaming everyone else. Perhaps you should learn what accountability feels like." Veronica cleared her throat sharply. "Please, let's not turn this into drama." I looked at her, calm and cold. You mistake clarity for drama. Olivia rose quickly, forcing a smile. How about some air? Let's go down to the lake. The view's lovely this time of year. Richard nodded, reaching for his cigar. Perfect idea. A little sunshine never hurt anyone. Except Daniel. We walked out to the terrace. The air was sharp, heavy with the scent of pine and damp soil. The lake shimmered under a sun struggling through the clouds. The wooden pier jutted into the water, the same one where Daniel had fallen. I stopped at the edge of the lawn, my heart tightening. The boards had been scrubbed clean as if nothing had ever happened. Even the post that had split his skin was gone, replaced with a smooth, new beam. Richard noticed me looking. Had it fixed, he said casually. No point keeping reminders of unpleasantness. Unpleasantness, I repeated. That's one word for it. He smiled thinly. We all have our ways of coping. Ethan opened another bottle of wine and poured himself a glass. Let's make a toast, he said. To forgiveness. Forgiveness, Richard echoed, raising his glass. The mark of a civilized family. I didn't move. Forgiveness without responsibility isn't virtue, it's cowardice. Olivia's face paled. Mom, please. Don't mom me, I said quietly. You watched him fall. Her lips trembled. It was an accident, I stepped closer. Then why did you laugh? Richard's voice cut through the air like a whip. Enough, he slammed his glass onto the railing. I won't have you accuse my family and my own home. Your home, I said softly, was built on fear. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain. The lake rippled for the first time that day. I could feel the storm coming not from the sky but from somewhere deeper, older. Ethan laughed awkwardly. Come on everyone, let's not ruin a perfectly good afternoon. But Richard wasn't listening anymore. His jaw worked as he ground the cigar between his teeth. You think you're so righteous, don't you? A retired teacher lecturing the world about morality. I don't lecture, I said. I grade. He took a step forward, towering over me. You're out of your depth, Eleanor. Am I? For a moment, we just stared at each other, the predator and the witness. Then the first drop of rain hit the pier, darkening the wood. Another followed and another until the lake blurred into silver mist. Olivia touched his arm. Dad, let's go inside. He didn't move. You don't scare me, he said, finally. You never will. I smiled faintly. I don't have to. Lightning flashed over the lake. They started to retreat toward the house, laughing off the tension, pretending nothing had happened. I remained where I was standing at the edge of the water, letting the rain soak through my coat. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches, shaking loose pine needles that scattered across the ground like confetti. The lake looked restless now, its surface trembling under the storm. I thought of Daniel's face beneath that same surface, eyes closed, hair drifting in the current. I thought of the way they had stood watching, their laughter rising over my screens. A single word formed on my lips, small, steady, certain. Soon. Thunder rolled over the hills, echoing like a promise. When I finally turned to leave, Richard was standing under the terrace roof watching me. His cigar was gone. Only the red tip of its ember glowed faintly before the rain extinguished it. He lifted his chin, a gesture of arrogance or maybe challenge. I met his gaze one last time and walked away. As I reached the car, Olivia called after me, her voice breaking. Mom, please don't do anything stupid. I didn't turn around. I stopped doing stupid things the day you married that man. The engine hummed softly as I drove off the property. In the rearview mirror, the Harper mansion shrank behind me, its glass walls reflecting the storm. For a brief second, a flash of lightning illuminated the pier, the same one that had almost become my son's grave. The rain beat harder against the windshield, blurring everything but the road ahead. I didn't wipe the tears from my face. I let them fall, mixing with the rain, cleansing nothing but carrying everything. The wind roared through the trees, as if whispering secrets long kept. And somewhere between the thunderclaps, I thought I heard the lake itself breathe slow, deep, alive. By the time I reached the main road, the storm had broken completely. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, smearing light and shadow together. I drove in silence, my pulse steady, my thoughts clear. The Harpers believed storms passed quickly, that money could dry the earth and make people forget. But they had never met one that remembered. This one did. And I was its eye. The hospital was quiet when I returned, the kind of silence that hums beneath fluorescent lights. Daniel was asleep, his chest rising steadily, color returning to his cheeks. The rain from Blue Ridge still clung to my coat, leaving dark stains across the fabric. I sat beside him, holding his hand, feeling the pulse that tethered him to this world. It was steady, warm, alive. That was all that mattered for now. I watched him breathe, and every inhale felt like an anchor. I had left that house behind me, but its poison lingered in my lungs. I could still smell Richard Harper's cologne, hear the crack of his voice when he told me I was out of my depth. For the first time, he was right. I was out of my depth, but not in the way he thought. I wasn't drowning anymore. I was learning how to move through the dark. The nurse came in quietly to adjust the IV. "He's improving," she whispered, smiling. "Strong boy." "He gets that from his father," I said automatically, then caught myself. "And from learning to survive people who think cruelty is strength." She hesitated, uncertain how to respond, then left the room with a polite nod. I looked at the small window where the storm had passed. The city outside was washed clean, the streets glistening under the amber streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded away. The phone in my coat pocket buzzed once. "Unknown number." I answered. "Eleanor," a low voice said. I didn't breathe. "Noah." "I read about the lake," he said. "Was it them?" "Yes." A pause, like a breath drawn through smoke. "And Daniel alive?" "Barely." "Good," he murmured. "Then we start now." I swallowed hard. "Noah, I'm not asking for." "You don't have to ask," he interrupted. "You made the call. You know what that means." The line went quiet for a moment. I could hear the sound of him flipping through papers, the faint hum of a computer. His voice softened when he spoke again. "You've spent too many years believing good manners can fix evil. They can't. But I can make them answer." I closed my eyes. "Just don't make it worse for Daniel." He laughed dryly. "You think they care about worse? You're talking about people who build empires on fear. Trust me, sis. They already made it worse." When he hung up, I stared at the dark screen, my reflection staring back, older, tired but steady. I remembered the last time I'd seen him. 10 years ago, we'd stood on my porch screaming at each other. He'd wanted me to help him expose a developer who'd stolen pension funds. I'd refused. "Some fights," I told him then, "aren't worth the cost." He'd pointed at me, eyes fierce. "And some silences are worth more than lives." Then he'd walked away, and I hadn't seen him since. Now I wondered which one of us had been right. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I sat by Daniel's bed, tracing the lines of his hand, memorizing every scar. Around midnight, a nurse brought me coffee. I thanked her and stared at the rising steam curling into the sterile air. Somewhere between exhaustion and fury, I began to write again in my notebook. Richard Harper. Empire built on deception. Olivia. Silence is her inheritance. Veronica. Elegance masking rot. Ethan. Cowardice in designer shoes. Each name was a weight. I wasn't sure what I was making, a list, a confession, or a map. Maybe all three. By morning, the world outside had turned pale gold. The snow that had fallen during the night melted into silver puddles along the pavement. Daniel opened his eyes, blinking against the light. "Mom, I'm here," I said softly. He smiled faintly. "You look tired." Then we match. He tried to laugh but winced. "It hurts." "Good," I said gently. "It means you're healing." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the window. "Did they call?" "No." "I didn't think they would," he whispered. "They never apologize. They just pretend nothing happened." "Not this time," I said. He turned to me slowly. "What are you going to do?" I brushed his hair back from his forehead. "Nothing you need to worry about." He frowned. "Mom, rest," I said. "That's your job." He closed his eyes again, though I knew sleep wouldn't come easily. When the doctor came for his rounds, I stepped into the hallway. He explained the recovery process, the scans, the therapy Daniel would need. I nodded, asked questions, took notes in the margins of my notebook as if they were part of a lesson plan. Old habits die hard. As I was leaving, I saw a bouquet on the nurse's station counter, white lilies, pristine and fragrant. The card was small, tucked discreetly between the flowers. Wishing Daniel a swift recovery, the Harpers. The nurse smiled. Beautiful, aren't they? They are, I said, though my voice caught slightly. Lilies. The same flowers that had been arranged on the table at the lake house. The same scent that had filled the air as Daniel fell. I took the bouquet, holding it just long enough to feel the petals crush under my fingers. Then I placed it gently into the trash bin beside the counter. The nurse blinked. Oh, was something wrong? No, I said, just allergic. Back in Daniel's room, I stared at the empty space where the flowers had been. Allergic wasn't a lie. I had developed an allergy to pretense, to cruelty, to the illusion of peace. Later that afternoon, I called the insurance company to confirm Daniel's coverage. The woman on the line mentioned that his employer had already submitted an updated form, Harper Development Group. They seem very efficient, she said cheerfully. Too efficient, I muttered. She laughed, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. When the call ended, I sat back in the chair and let the weight of it settle. Richard was already controlling the narrative. They were erasing guilt before the ink had even dried. I went to the hospital garden for air. The sky was clear now, the air cold enough to sting. A fountain trickled near the benches, the water glittering in the winter light. A young woman sat nearby with a sleeping baby in her arms. She looked exhausted but peaceful. When she noticed me, she smiled faintly. Long night, she asked. Several, I said. She nodded, rocking the baby gently. You pray they get better. And if they do, you promise yourself you'll be grateful for the rest of your life. But when the fear fades, you start remembering who hurt them. I looked at her, startled by the bluntness. You speak from experience, she smiled sadly. My husband. Drunk driver, he lived. The man who hit him didn't even lose his license. What did you do? Her eyes met mine, sharp beneath their weariness. Waited until I stopped shaking. Then I made sure he never drove again. She stood gathering her blanket and walked away before I could reply. For a long time I sat there listening to the fountain. Her words echoed in my mind like footsteps. Waited until I stopped shaking. By the time I returned to Daniel's room, my hands had stopped trembling. My voice had too. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Noah's name glowed at the bottom of the list. I typed a single message. The flowers arrived. You were right. His reply came seconds later. Good. I'm already digging. Check your email tonight. When I sat down again beside Daniel, the machines hummed softly. His breathing was even. The steady rhythm filled the room like music, proof of survival, proof of reason. But reason could wait. I looked out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere far beyond the city, that lake lay still, under the weight of winter, holding its secrets beneath the surface. Not for much longer. The world would soon know what the Harpers had done. And this time, no amount of lilies would cover the smell of rot. The email arrived just after midnight. The hospital lights had dimmed for the night shift, and the corridors outside Daniel's room were silent except for the hum of the vending machine. I sat on the edge of the narrow couch, my laptop open on my knees, the glow reflecting in my tired eyes. The subject line read, Harper, Ellery file. My pulse quickened. Noah never used subjects casually. Inside were scanned documents, old photographs, clippings from 2 decades ago, an entire world I hadn't known existed. At the top of the thread he'd written, Thought you should see this before I make a move. It's all connected. I scrolled slowly. A newspaper article from 21 years ago. Local businessman drowns in Blue Ridge Lake, accident declared. The photo beneath the headline made my stomach tighten. 2 men standing on a boat, one smiling into the camera, the other turned away. The smiling one was Richard Harper, younger but unmistakable. The other was named Thomas Ellery. I kept reading. The report said both men had been drinking. A sudden storm, a fall, no foul play suspected. Ellery had left behind a wife and a 10-year-old son. I leaned closer to the screen. In the corner of the photo behind the two men, the lake stretched gray and endless. The same water. The same pier. My phone buzzed. Noah again. You still awake? Yes. Then listen, he wrote. Ellery's wife moved to Atlanta after the accident. The detective who closed the case retired 2 years later. He lives near the Sierra foothills now. The old man remembers everything and he feels guilty. I'm meeting him tomorrow. I typed back quickly. Be careful. Always am, he replied. You'll get more soon. Don't talk to anyone yet. I shut the laptop and stared at the dark screen until I saw my own reflection staring back. The face of a woman who had outlived fear. In the next bed, Daniel shifted in his sleep. I reached out, touched his wrist gently and whispered, We're getting closer. Morning came with a pale light creeping across the blinds. The hospital smelled of coffee and disinfectant. Daniel was awake, sitting up slowly. You didn't sleep again, he said. I had work, I replied. He smiled faintly. Mom, you don't work anymore. I looked at him. Some lessons never retire. Before he could ask what I meant, a nurse came in to check his vitals. When she left, Daniel said quietly, Olivia called this morning. My hand froze. What did she want? She said she wants to come visit. No, I said sharply. Not here. He frowned. She sounded worried. Worried about herself, I corrected. Not about you. He looked down at his hands pale against the white sheets. I used to think she loved me. You were raised to believe people mean what they say, I said softly. The Harpers were raised to believe words are weapons. He sighed and turned toward the window. I don't even know who I was trying to prove myself to anymore. You don't have to prove anything, I said. Not anymore. When he fell asleep again, I stepped out into the hallway. The snow outside had melted into thin patches of ice. I bought another coffee from the machine, holding the paper cup between my palms, as if warmth could erase the image of that article. The past was starting to crawl back to the surface, and I knew exactly who had disturbed it. Noah called that evening. His voice was low measured. I found him, he said. Detective Healy. Took some convincing, but he talked. What did he say? Pressure from above, Noah said. He got an envelope full of cash and a photo of his daughter. They told him to close the file and forget Ellery ever existed. Richard Harper made sure of it. You were right, Eleanor. The lake isn't just a place, it's a burial ground for truth. My stomach clenched. Are you recording this? I already did, he said. And I have copies of the old police report, the bribes, even the missing witness statement. Ellery's son kept letters from his father, letters that mention a falling out with Richard just days before his death. I closed my eyes. How bad is it? Noah's answer came cold and steady. Bad enough to burn the whole Harper family tree. I looked over at Daniel through the glass door, the IV tubes glinting under the fluorescent light. Do it, I said. You sure? Yes. They built their empire on lies. It's time someone rewrites the foundation. He chuckled softly. There's the sister I remember. After the call ended, I sat in the small hospital chapel again. The candle I'd lit 2 days before had long since burned out. I lit a new one, watching the flame tremble before steadying. Each flicker felt like a heartbeat, fragile but relentless. When I returned to Daniel's room, the nurse at the desk stopped me. Mrs. Cole, you had a delivery. On the counter sat another bouquet, white lilies again. Bigger this time. Their scent hit me before I even touched them. I stared at the card. For Daniel's continued recovery, with love, Olivia. I didn't speak. I just carried the flowers into the nearest restroom and dumped them into the trash. Their petals floated in the water for a moment, before sinking pale ghosts disappearing into the drain. I washed my hands slowly, the smell of lilies clinging to my skin no matter how hard I scrubbed. When I came back, the nurse looked at me uncertainly. Something wrong, ma'am? No, I said, just cleaning up. I stayed by Daniel's bed for hours, my mind circling back to that word, love. Love had always been the Harpers' favorite disguise, a way to wrap poison in ribbons. At midnight, my phone lit up again. A text from Noah got what I need, sending files to a secure server. Don't talk to anyone until I say. They'll know soon. I typed back, what will happen to them, whatever the truth decides, he wrote. I left the phone on the table and looked out the window. The night outside was still. No snow, no rain, only the reflection of the hospital lights trembling on the wet glass. Somewhere far away, I could almost see that lake again, the surface unbroken, pretending innocence. But I knew better now. Lakes remember. Water doesn't bury, it preserves. I turned back to Daniel, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. His breathing was soft, rhythmic. I brushed his hair back and whispered, "Rest, my heart. The storm's coming, but it's ours this time." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of pine, and something colder, sharper, like the beginning of justice. Noah's message came at dawn, found the sun. Heading to Atlanta. Keep your phone on. The screen lit the dim hospital room, pale light spilling across Daniel's bed. He was still asleep, his breathing even a trace of color back in his cheeks. I watched him for a moment before slipping the phone into my coat pocket. The corridor outside was quiet. Nurses whispered at their station. Somewhere, a machine beeped in a steady rhythm, like a heart remembering its purpose. I needed air. The hospital garden was nearly empty, except for a janitor sweeping frost from the path. The air smelled of pine and diesel. I walked slowly between the benches, letting my breath cloud the cold morning air. The world was waking up again, unaware that somewhere in Atlanta, my brother was digging up the bones of monsters. When I returned to Daniel's room, a nurse told me Olivia had called. She wanted to confirm visiting hours, the nurse said gently. Tell her he's resting, I replied, and that he doesn't need more flowers. The nurse hesitated. She said her father might come too. I smiled thinly. Then I'll make sure to be here. An hour later, Olivia appeared in the doorway wrapped in a beige coat, her makeup perfect. The hallway lights reflected in her diamond earrings. She carried another bouquet roses, this time blood red. Hi Mom, she said softly. Can I come in? I looked at her for a long moment before stepping aside. He's sleeping. Don't wake him. She moved to the bedside, staring at Daniel's face, her own unreadable. He looks better, she murmured. I've been praying for him. Praying doesn't wash blood off your hands, I said. Her head snapped up. That's unfair. So was what your family did. She flinched but said nothing. She set the flowers down on the table, fingers trembling slightly. Dad wanted me to tell you he's sorry about the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding, I repeated. Is that what you call attempted murder? Her eyes filled with tears she didn't bother to hide. Please don't twist this. You don't know how much pressure he's under. He's not a bad man. No, I said quietly. He's worse than that. He's a man who never learned shame. Olivia's jaw clenched. For a second her composure cracked and I saw the fear beneath. Then she took a shaky breath. You're going to regret this. You don't know the people you're dealing with. I stepped closer. You're wrong. I know them too well. I've spent years pretending not to. She grabbed her purse and fled without another word. When the door shut behind her, the air felt lighter. I picked up the bouquet she'd brought and placed it carefully in the trash can. The phone buzzed again. Noah. I stepped into the hall before answering. You're going to want to hear this, he said without greeting. His voice carried that clipped excitement he always had when he smelled blood in the water. The Ellery boy's name is Mark. Works in a small garage outside Atlanta. I showed him the files, his father's letters, the bank transfers, the falsified report. He didn't even blink. He's been waiting 20 years for someone to come asking. What did he say? He said Richard Harper killed his father, Noah replied, and he can prove it. My hand tightened around the phone. How his father wrote letters to his sister before he died. Said Harper was cheating him out of their business shares. Said he was going to the district attorney. A week later, he was dead. And get this, Mark kept one of his father's journals. Inside, there's an entry from the day before he drowned. Meeting Richard at the lake tomorrow. Time to settle this like men. The words chilled me. Does he still have it? He gave me a copy, Noah said. I'm sending scans to your email. The handwriting matches the police samples. I'll get a forensics guy to confirm it. I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes. He'll deny everything. Of course he will, Noah said. But this time denial won't be enough. The mayor's already distancing himself from Harper. The investors are nervous. One story, just one, will break them. I could hear traffic behind him, the distant rumble of a city already awake. Noah, I said quietly, don't do anything rash. He laughed softly. You're the one who called me, remember? You don't hire a fireman and then complain about the smoke. Before I could answer, he hung up. Back in the room, Daniel stirred. I sat beside him and smoothed the blanket. His eyes fluttered open. Mom, he whispered. Was that Olivia? Yes. She came to apologize. He gave a weak laugh that turned into a cough. She never apologizes. She negotiates. Then maybe she's running out of things to trade, I said. He smiled faintly, then closed his eyes again. You sound different, he murmured. I am, I said. I finally remembered who I am. The rest of the day passed in slow motion. Doctors came and went. Daniel's color improved and his appetite returned a little. He asked for tea in the evening and I made it myself in the staff lounge. When I brought it back, he was asleep again, his face relaxed, boyish. I sat by the window watching the sun sink behind the rooftops. In the reflection, I saw myself older, yes, but not smaller. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing inside my own skin. At sunset, Noah called again. It's starting, he said. What is the cracks? Harper's partner from the old construction firm just contacted a journalist friend of mine. Says he's willing to talk if he gets immunity. He knows about the offshore accounts and the shell companies. Everything. My throat went dry. That fast, I told you, Noah said. When men like Richard fall, they don't fall alone. They drag down everyone who touched them. By morning, the press will smell blood. And you, he chuckled. I'm just lighting the match. After the call, I sat in the dimming room, the hum of the machines wrapping around me like a heartbeat. For a long time, I said nothing. Then quietly I whispered, do what you do best, Noah. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering dried leaves across the hospital parking lot. I could almost hear the echo of the lake in it, the whisper of cold water against wood, the memory of that splash. When the night nurse came in, she found me still sitting by the window. Mrs. Cole, she said gently, you should get some rest. I will, I said, though we both knew it was a lie. She smiled kindly. You're a strong woman. No, I murmured, staring out at the dark horizon. I'm just a mother who ran out of fear. The nurse left quietly. The lights dimmed. I opened my notebook again, turned to a fresh page, and wrote at the top, Harper, Ellery, Justice. The ink bled slightly on the paper, dark and permanent. Beneath it, I added one more line, storm approaching. Then I closed the book, folded my hands, and waited for the morning. The lilies arrived before sunrise. The nurse found them at the reception desk with my name written in looping silver ink to Mrs. Eleanor Cole with warm wishes, the Harpers. The bouquet was enormous, suffocatingly perfect, every petal white as bone. The scent hit me like a memory, the sharp sweetness of the lake air, the cold sting of water, Daniel's lifeless face breaking the surface. I stood staring at them for a long time. The nurse smiled politely. They must really care, she said. Yes, I murmured. They care deeply about appearances. I carried the bouquet to Daniel's room. The flowers didn't belong there. The monitors beeped softly, a fragile proof of life. Daniel was awake now, pale but alert, a book open on his lap. He looked up and frowned. What's that smell? Forgiveness, I said. He watched me drop the bouquet into the trash bin. You shouldn't waste them, Mom. They were never mine to keep, I replied. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't have to. Outside, the winter sun fought its way through gray clouds. The hospital windows reflected light in sharp fragments like the surface of the lake when the storm began that night. I went down to the cafeteria for coffee, but the bitterness of it didn't reach me. The scent of lilies still clung to my skin. By the time I returned upstairs, my phone buzzed with a message from Noah. They're nervous. 2 lawyers resigned this morning. Richard's been calling everyone he owns. I texted back, "Good. Let him sweat." "He will," Noah replied. "But don't answer if they reach out to you." I didn't tell him they already had. Olivia was waiting outside Daniel's room when I came back. Her coat was immaculate, her perfume faint but deliberate. She smiled, eyes shining in that rehearsed way of hers. "Mom," she said softly, "you look tired. Can we talk?" I folded my arms. "About what about ending this?" I said nothing and she hurried on, her voice trembling between guilt and calculation. "Dad's? He's not well. The press has been calling non-stop since that stupid blog post your brother wrote. He's furious, but he's scared too. You don't want this to get uglier, do you? It's already ugly," I said. "And it's only beginning." She swallowed hard. "You think you can win against him, against all of us?" "I'm not fighting him," I said quietly. "I'm correcting him." Her face tightened, the charm slipping for a moment. "He made a mistake, that's all. We all did. But dragging our family through the mud won't fix Daniel." I leaned in, lowering my voice until it was almost gentle. "You think I care about fixing Daniel? He's already stronger than any of you. What I'm fixing is history." She stared at me, tears brightening her eyes. "You used to like me." "No," I said. "I used to hope you'd learn." She turned away, blinking fast. "You're cruel. I learned from the best." She left before I could see whether she was crying or angry. Maybe both. When she was gone, I sat by the window watching snow begin to fall. The flakes melted on the glass as quickly as they appeared, leaving no trace. That's what the Harpers believed in, making messes disappear. The phone rang an hour later. The number was blocked. I didn't need to check to know who it was. Eleanor Richard Harper's voice filled the room, smooth as oil, tired but controlled. "You've made quite a spectacle of yourself." "I suppose I learned from watching you," I said. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You've always been dramatic. But I'm calling to give you an opportunity. Withdraw your brother's lies before they destroy what's left of your son's peace. You don't want him dragged through this circus, do you?" I looked at Daniel, asleep again. "Peace doesn't come from pretending," I said. His voice hardened. "You're playing a dangerous game, Eleanor. You don't have the stomach for this kind of war." "You're right," I said calmly. "That's why I don't play." I finish. There was silence on the line, heavy and cold. Then he spoke softly. "You'll regret this." "I already do," I said. "Every minute I spent believing you were human." The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long time, the hum of the machines, the only sound left. Then, without thinking, I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence: "Send the flowers back." That evening, I went down to the hospital's small flower shop. The clerk, a kind woman with silver hair, looked up when she saw me carrying the bouquet from the trash. I had pulled the lilies out, trimmed the bruised stems, tied them with a ribbon. "Beautiful," she said. "Would you like them delivered somewhere?" "Yes," I said, "to the Harper estate. Use this note." She took the small envelope I handed her without reading it. "Any special message?" I smiled faintly. "Just the truth." Inside the envelope on heavy paper I had written in neat measured handwriting, "You sent me peace. I'm returning memory." By the time I came back upstairs, Daniel was awake again. He looked stronger, more alive. "You're smiling," he said, confused. "Am I?" I poured water into his glass. "Maybe it's just the lighting." He laughed softly, though his eyes were curious. "Mom, what are you planning?" "Nothing," I said, "just house cleaning." He frowned but didn't press. That night, snow fell heavier, blanketing the parking lot in white. I sat awake, unable to sleep, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights above me. Around midnight, a text from Noah appeared. "He's calling in favors. Politicians, investors, old friends. They're all backing away. Whatever you did, it scared him." I typed back, "I sent him flowers." There was a pause before his reply came. "That's poetic. You always had a flair for the dramatic." "You taught me," I wrote. The next morning, Olivia didn't call. Neither did Richard. But by noon, the hospital's front desk received a call from a courier service. A package had arrived for me, addressed in Richard Harper's handwriting. The receptionist brought it upstairs. It was small, wrapped in expensive brown paper. Inside was a single white lily pressed between glass, framed like art. No note. I held it in my hands for a long time, studying the trapped petals, perfect and preserved. It looked beautiful. It looked dead. I set the frame on the bedside table and turned it face down. Daniel stirred in his sleep, murmuring something I couldn't make out. I brushed his hand lightly and whispered, "Rest, my love. The ghosts are getting restless." The snow outside continued to fall, thick and silent. The world was turning white, washing itself clean. But I knew better. Some stains don't fade, they sink deeper. The Harpers thought they could remind me of death. Instead, I'd reminded them that it still knew their names. When the nurse came in for evening rounds, she found me standing at the window, looking out at the falling snow. "You should rest, Mrs. Cole," she said gently. "You've been awake for days." "I'll sleep soon," I said. "I just want to watch the snow cover everything for a while." "Pretty, isn't it?" "Yes," I said softly. "Until it melts." She smiled and left, and I stood there alone, watching the world disappear beneath a layer of white. Somewhere miles away, a delivery truck was turning down a long private road lined with pines, heading toward a house built of glass and lies. And on the seat beside the driver, wrapped in soft paper, were the lilies I'd returned, fragile, perfect, and carrying a message that didn't need words. Noah published the story at 3:17 inches the morning. I didn't see it happen, I felt it. A shift in the air, like a window breaking somewhere far away. When I woke, the hospital TV was already flashing with headlines. Real estate tycoon linked to 20year-old Lake death. Beneath the banner was Richard Harper's face, grim and colorless. The news anchor's voice trembled between professionalism and disbelief. I stood by the window, the cold light of dawn spilling over the city, and watched the world finally catch up. The phone started ringing before 7. First, Olivia. Then numbers I didn't recognize. Reporters, lawyers. I turned it off. Down the hall, a nurse was whispering to another, her eyes flicking toward me. The story had spread fast. The article was everywhere. Noah had sent it to every outlet that still valued truth. It included photos, copies of documents, the recorded confession of Detective Healy, and even the letter from Ellery's son. Each paragraph was a blade. Each name, a wound reopening. Daniel was awake, reading the headline on his own phone. His hands shook slightly. "Is this your brother?" "Yes." He looked at me for a long moment, a dozen emotions flickering behind his eyes: fear, disbelief, gratitude. "You did this." "I gave him a reason," I said. He set the phone aside. "Mom, they'll come for you. They've already had their chance." Outside, sirens wailed somewhere in the distance. I imagined them rushing toward that mansion by the lake, its windows glinting in the early light. I wondered if Richard was awake yet. If he had read the words that would finally undo him. By mid-morning, every screen in the hospital lobby carried the same footage, reporters crowding the gates of the Harper estate, cameras, flashing microphones thrust toward a man who once believed himself untouchable. His face was pale, his movements slow, like someone drowning in air. Olivia stood beside him, trembling, mascara streaking down her cheeks as questions flew. "Mr. Harper, did you kill Thomas Ellery? Is it true your son assaulted his brother-in-law? Do you have any comment on the evidence leaked this morning?" He didn't answer. He just pushed past them, the door slamming shut behind him. A doctor passed by and muttered under his breath, "Looks like karma's quicker than the courts these days." I smiled faintly. Sometimes it just needs a little help. That afternoon, Noah called. "It's spreading faster than I thought," he said. I could hear typing in the background, the clatter of chaos he thrived in. TV, radio, blogs everywhere. The DA's office just reopened both cases. Ellery and Daniels. The Harpers are lawyering up, but it's too late. "Good," I said. "You don't sound surprised." "I'm not." He paused, then said quietly, "You did it, sis. You got your justice." "No," I said. "We got the truth. Justice still has to find its legs." I heard him exhale on the other end. "You always were the patient one." I laughed softly. "Not anymore." By evening, the hospital felt different. People whispered when I passed, as if standing near me made the story more real. The nurse who used to avoid eye contact now smiled shyly when she brought Daniel's medication. I didn't care about any of it. All I cared about was the sound of my son's breathing, steady and strong, no longer bound to machines. When night fell, I turned on the TV again. The cameras showed the Harpers' property under flashing police lights. A voiceover reported the arrests Richard Harper and his son Ethan Harper taken into custody pending investigation for manslaughter and obstruction of justice. Olivia wasn't shown, but her name appeared on the screen labeled Cooperative Witness. Daniel watched beside me silent. Finally he whispered, "It's over." "No," I said. "It's just honest now." He looked at me, eyes shining with exhaustion and something like relief. "You're not afraid," I thought about that. The fear had burned out long ago, replaced by something colder, cleaner. "Not anymore," I said. "You can't scare a woman who's already lost everything she loves." The next morning the world had changed again. The Harper Development Group suspended all operations. Partners withdrew. Politicians who once toasted Richard were now denying ever knowing him. Every paper carried a version of the story. Every one of them quoted Noah's line, "The truth may drown, but it never dies." I sat by the window watching snow melt on the street, the light shimmering in small puddles. Daniel was reading quietly, his face calm, for the first time in weeks. He glanced at me and smiled. "Do you feel better?" I thought of all the years I had tried to keep the peace, all the words I had swallowed, all the small humiliations I had dressed up as politeness. I thought of that night at the lake, the laughter, the splash, the silence. "I feel alive," I said. Late that afternoon, Noah called again, his voice steady but weary. "It's done." The DA confirmed formal charges. "They're both in custody without bail. It's over." I listened to the static between us. "You should rest," I said. He chuckled. "So should you." "I will." A pause. "You're not celebrating." "No," I said softly. "Celebrations are for victories." This was correction. He sighed. "You never change." I changed the only way that mattered. After he hung up, I sat for a long time watching the sky turn gold. The city outside was humming again, normal, indifferent, alive. Somewhere beyond the skyline, the Harper estate was just another house losing its light. A nurse knocked gently. "Mrs. Cole, your son's doctor says he can be discharged next week." "Thank you," I said. She smiled. "You must be relieved." I nodded. Relief feels strange after so much noise. When she left, I walked to the window again. Snow had begun falling lightly, soft flakes swirling in the fading light. The world looked clean, but I knew better. Nothing was ever clean, only quieter. Daniel stirred. "What happens now? We start again," I said. He smiled faintly. "Without them, because of them," I replied. That night, I dreamed of the lake. Not the black water or the cold, but the surface, smooth, endless, reflecting the moon. I saw Daniel standing on the dock, a live hole, the wind lifting his hair. Somewhere behind him, laughter echoed once and faded into nothing. When I woke, the first rays of dawn filled the room. I made tea, the steam curling through the air like breath. The hospital TV was still on the anchor, repeating the same headline. I turned it off. For the first time in months, there was silence. Not the heavy, suffocating kind, but the peaceful silence that comes after a storm when everything broken has already fallen. I looked at Daniel sleeping softly and whispered, "We did it." Outside, the snow stopped falling. The world for a moment was perfectly still. The first newspaper that didn't have their faces on it felt strange in my hands. A quiet Tuesday issue full of weather forecasts, supermarket sales, and nothing that could hurt me. I folded it neatly and dropped it into the trash. For weeks, the world had fed on the Harpers' downfall, but now the noise had finally faded. The headlines moved on. People forgot. That was the mercy and cruelty of time. It buried everything, even justice. Daniel was walking again, slow but steady. His color had returned, and his smile was no longer forced. The doctor called it a remarkable recovery. I called it survival. We moved to a smaller room with a view of the garden. The air smelled like soap and pine, the kind of clean that feels temporary. One morning I brought tea and found him sitting by the window with the newspaper folded in his lap. They sentenced them, he said quietly. I know, 8 years for Richard, 5 for Ethan. He hesitated, his voice low. That's all. I poured the tea and set it down beside him. It's never enough. He looked at me, eyes tired but searching. Do you ever wish you'd done things differently? I thought of the lilies, the phone calls, the trembling voice on the other end of the line. I thought of the moment I'd chosen action over forgiveness. No, I said finally. I just wish I hadn't waited so long. He nodded slowly, fingers tracing the edge of the cup. You know, I keep thinking about that night. I don't remember the fall. Just the cold. And your voice. You heard me. Faintly, he said. You kept saying my name. I smiled, though it felt fragile. I didn't stop until you breathed again. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The snow outside had melted into patches of muddy grass. Winter was dying, but it refused to leave quietly. When Daniel dozed off, I walked down to the hospital courtyard. The garden was empty except for a nurse feeding crumbs to a flock of pigeons. I sat on the same bench where I'd met that woman weeks ago, the one who'd lost her husband to a drunk driver. The air was softer now, the fountain trickling gently. I closed my eyes and listened to the water. The sound carried me back to that lake, to that night, to the darkness that had swallowed us both. But this time I didn't see blood or terror. I saw motion. Renewal. The water had changed. It was still the same lake, but it no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a mirror. When I opened my eyes, the nurse had gone. The pigeons were pecking at the last crumbs. I whispered to the empty air, "It's over," but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't. Some endings don't arrive with peace, they just arrive with silence. That afternoon, Olivia came to the hospital. She didn't call ahead. She just appeared in the doorway, dressed simply, no jewelry, no perfume. For a moment she looked like the girl Daniel had once fallen in love with, unguarded, unsure of her own footing. "Can I come in?" she asked. Daniel looked at me. I nodded. She stepped inside, holding a small envelope. "I know you probably don't want to see me. I wouldn't either. But I needed to say something before you both disappear from our lives completely." Daniel's voice was quiet. "You don't owe us anything." "I owe you everything," she said, her eyes glistening. "I was a coward. I should have stopped them. I should have spoken up that night." "I don't," Daniel interrupted. "You can't rewrite it." She nodded, clutching the envelope. "This isn't an apology. It's proof." I frowned. Proof of what? She handed it to me. Inside were photographs, scanned documents, contracts, and old handwritten notes. My father kept everything, she said. He had duplicates hidden in a safe. Offshore accounts, fake invoices. I found them when the police raided the house. I didn't tell them. "Why bring them to us?" she swallowed. "Because I couldn't destroy them. I thought, maybe you'd know what to do." I looked down at the papers. Richard Harper's signature appeared again and again, neat and arrogant. Every lie, every theft, every bribe spelled out in ink. "You'll be charged for withholding evidence," I said. "I know," her voice cracked. "But I can't keep lying for him." For the first time I saw her without her armor. Just a girl raised in the shadow of men who believed the world was theirs to break. Daniel took her hand briefly. "You can't undo the past," he said, "but you can stop living in it." She nodded, eyes red, and left without another word. When the door closed, I set the envelope on the table. "What will you do with it?" Daniel asked. "Nothing," I said. "The system will. I've done my part." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window watching snowdrift lazily through the streetlights. The world looked quiet, almost innocent again. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang soft and hollow. I wondered if they were for forgiveness or warning. At dawn, I found myself writing in my notebook again. The pages were nearly full now, each line a fragment of this long winter. I wrote, "Revenge tasted sharp. Justice tasted quiet. Healing has no taste at all, only warmth." I closed the notebook and went to check on Daniel. He was awake, staring at the ceiling. "Mom," he said softly. "What happens when we leave here? We start over." "We're home," I said. "Our real one." He smiled faintly. The old apartment, yes. The one with the broken radiator and the window that sticks. I miss that window, he said. You always said it kept the noise out. I laughed softly. It kept more than noise out. It kept us whole. We were discharged 3 days later. The nurses hugged Daniel, the doctor shook my hand, and for the first time in months we stepped outside without fear. The cold air bit at my face, but it felt clean. The sky was pale, almost spring-like. As we walked to the car, Daniel stopped and looked up at the hospital. I don't know how to thank you, he said. Don't, I told him. Just live. He nodded. And you, I will too. The drive home was quiet. The city passed by in soft blurs of gray and gold. Storefronts opening. Children waiting for buses. Life continuing as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened. When we reached the old neighborhood, I felt a rush of something I hadn't felt in years: belonging. The streets were cracked, the buildings worn, but it was ours. Daniel carried the box of medicines up the stairs while I unlocked the door. The lock clicked, and the scent of dust and memory greeted us. The apartment looked smaller than I remembered, the wallpaper faded, but sunlight spilled through the curtains, warm and familiar. Daniel set the box down and looked around. It's like nothing ever changed. Some things shouldn't, I said. He walked to the window and pushed it open. It stuck halfway as always, then gave with a groan. A gust of cold air swept in, carrying the scent of the city. Still works, he said. I smiled, standing in the doorway, my hands folded around the envelope Olivia had left. The papers inside rustled, faintly fragile and powerful. Mom, Daniel said, turning back to me. You really think we can start over? I looked around the room at the dust motes swirling in the sunlight, at the familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet. Starting over isn't about leaving the past, I said. It's about not letting it own us. He smiled. Then, let's begin. We unpacked in silence. The city outside moved on, unaware that somewhere in a small apartment above an old library, 2 people were learning to breathe again. When night fell, I made tea, and Daniel sat by the window with his guitar. He strummed softly, out of tune, but the sound filled the room like light. I closed my eyes and listened. The world outside was still wounded, but for the first time so was I, and it didn't hurt, it healed. The morning we left the hospital, the air smelled of thawing snow and exhaust. Daniel walked beside me, his steps still uneven but steady enough to make me proud. The nurse waved from the doorway, her voice warm. Good luck, Mr. Cole. Take care of your mom. Daniel laughed softly and turned to me. Did you hear that? Guess I'm the one taking care of you now? I think we'll manage each other, I said. We stepped into the cold sunlight, and for the first time in months I felt the ground beneath my feet without dread. The world was moving again. Cars hummed, people hurried past, and no one looked at us like we were survivors of something tragic. We were just another mother and son walking toward home. The drive was quiet. The snow along the highway had melted into dull gray slush, and the trees were bare, their branches reaching skyward like tired hands. Daniel gazed out the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass. You know what's strange, he said. It feels like I was gone for years, not weeks. You were, I said. In a way. He nodded thoughtful and let the silence return. When the skyline of our neighborhood appeared, old brick buildings, rusted balconies, faded murals, I felt something shift in my chest. This was where we had built our small life before the Harpers had tried to erase it. The apartment wasn't much, but it was real, and it was ours. Daniel carried the last box up the stairs while I unlocked the door. The sound of the key turning in that old lock was music. Inside, dust hung in the air like mist catching the morning light. The walls still bore faint outlines where pictures once hung. The radiator hissed softly, that familiar clunky rhythm we used to complain about every winter. It's smaller than I remember, Daniel said, setting the box down. Or maybe we got used to too much space, I replied. We worked in quiet harmony, unpacking what little we had left: books, clothes, old photographs. I found my favorite teapot wrapped in newspaper, its handle slightly chipped. When I held it, my hands stopped trembling for the first time in weeks. Daniel fixed the curtains while I arranged the kitchen shelves. Every movement felt like reclaiming something stolen. By afternoon, the apartment had come alive again. The sun poured through the crooked blinds, painting long golden stripes across the floor. Daniel was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, tuning his old guitar. I leaned against the doorway, listening to the first tentative notes fill the room. They were imperfect, uneven, but they sounded like home. "Remember this song?" he asked, strumming softly. "Of course. You used to play it every night when you thought I was asleep." He smiled, a little embarrassed. "You never said anything. I didn't want you to stop." We both laughed quietly. It was the kind of laughter that carried warmth, not sorrow. For the first time, the weight between us wasn't grief. It was peace. That evening, as the sun began to fade, a video call came through. Noah's face appeared on the screen, older than I remembered, tired but still with that same defiant glint in his eyes. "Well, well," he said. "The legendary Eleanor Cole back in her castle." "Castle might be generous," I said, "but it has better light than a hospital." He grinned. I read the sentencing notes. Richard's appeal was denied. His empire's gone. Even the house by the lake is being seized. "Good," I said softly. "Let the water take it back." He leaned back, lighting a cigarette. "You did what most people only dream of doing, sis. You stood up to the devil and walked away." I shook my head. "No one walks away. We just learn how to live with the echo." "Still poetic," he said, exhaling smoke. "You going to start writing again?" I smiled faintly. "Maybe. But for now, I'm just cleaning up my shelves." "Well, if you ever get bored, I've got another story that needs telling. No more crusades, Noah. Not for a while." He laughed, the sound rough and familiar. "All right then. Rest. You've earned it." Before hanging up, he raised his cup of coffee toward the screen. "To truth," he said. "To truth," I echoed. After the call ended, Daniel came to the door holding 2 mugs of tea. "Uncle Noah, still the same, worse," I said, smiling. "But in a good way." He handed me a cup and sat down on the couch beside me. The radiator hissed again, and outside the city, lights blinked on one by one. "You think we'll be okay here?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "We were okay before. We just forgot how it felt." He nodded, his expression soft. "You know what I realized? I used to think love was about keeping peace. But maybe it's about telling the truth even when it hurts. That's the only kind of love that lasts," I said. We drank in silence, the tea, warm and familiar. The air smelled faintly of dust, jasmine, and new beginnings. Later that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, I stayed awake reading one of my old books. The pages were yellowed, the spine cracked, but the words still held. I traced a line I used to teach my students. "The wound is the place where the light enters you." I finally understood it. I closed the book and walked to the window. The city below shimmered in soft orange light. A street musician was playing somewhere nearby, the faint melody floating up through the air. I thought of the lake again, how it had once seemed endless, how its silence had terrified me. Now, when I pictured it, the water was calm, no longer a place of loss, but reflection. I whispered into the glass, "You can rest now." The next morning, Daniel woke early and found me still sitting by the window. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. "Not really. You're supposed to be resting." "I am," I said, "just differently." He poured us both coffee and sat beside me. The street below buzzed with life, children chasing each other through melting snow, an old man selling newspapers from his cart, a woman opening the bakery on the corner. Everything ordinary, everything precious. "Funny," Daniel said. "This is the same view I used to think was boring." "That's because you didn't know what the world could take from you," I said. He smiled quietly. "And now you know what it can give back." The morning light touched his face, and for a moment he looked like the boy who used to wait for me at the school gate with his lunchbox and his endless hope. The sight of it filled me with something gentle, something new. When he left for his therapy session later that day, I stayed behind and tidied the apartment. Every shelf, every corner, every little thing found its place again. I moved slowly, deliberately, like a librarian restoring order to a long-forgotten archive. When I was done, the room was quiet, and the afternoon light lay across the floor in golden stripes. I made one last cup of tea and stood at the window watching the city breathe. Somewhere far away, the Harper estate was probably being gutted, its glass walls dismantled, its trophies boxed up and sold. Empires crumble the way ice melts slowly, then all at once. But I wasn't thinking about them anymore. I was thinking about us. About what it meant to come home, not to a place, but to a self you thought you'd lost. Daniel returned that evening carrying a small potted plant. For the window, he said. Something alive. I placed it on the sill, smiling. Perfect. He looked around, breathing deeply. It already feels like home. It is, I said. It always was. The city outside dimmed into twilight. Somewhere church bells rang again, soft and steady. I took a deep breath and whispered, "We made it back." Daniel turned toward me. Back from where? From everything, I said. He smiled, and for the first time in a long time, I smiled back without thinking. Spring came late that year. The last of the snow melted along the gutters, and the trees outside our window began to bloom in shy bursts of green. Daniel's plant on the sill had grown taller, leaning toward the sunlight. Every morning I opened the window just enough for the breeze to carry in the smell of rain and earth. For months we had lived in quiet, without headlines, without lawyers, without fear. It was strange, this silence, not empty but full, like a house finally breathing again. Daniel found work at a small community center, teaching music to children. Every evening he came home smelling of chalk dust and laughter. The first time he walked through the door with that smile, the one I thought I'd lost forever, I realized the lake had taken a lot from us, but it hadn't taken everything. One night he brought home a girl. Her name was Claire. She had kind eyes, and when she laughed, she looked at Daniel as if the world were still worth loving. I made tea for them and listened to their conversation drift down the hallway. It wasn't love yet, but it had that fragile sound of something being built carefully without lies. After they left, I sat by the window with my notebook. The last page was still blank. I'd filled the rest with memories, truths, and pieces of myself I didn't know I'd saved. I picked up my pen and wrote, "I thought revenge would feel like victory. Instead, it felt like returning to the beginning, where love is quiet, and peace isn't something you win, but something you learn to live inside." A knock on the door pulled me back. Daniel poked his head in. "You writing again? Just notes," I said. He smiled. "Good. People need stories like yours. I think they already have enough sad ones." "Then make this one about hope," he said softly. "You earned it." That night I dreamed of water again. But this time it wasn't dark. It shimmered with sunlight, and the ripples caught reflections of sky and trees. The lake no longer frightened me. It looked like forgiveness. In the morning the phone rang. It was Noah. I hadn't heard his voice in weeks. "You sound peaceful," he said. "I might be," I answered. I'm working on something new. A different kind of story. Thought I'd send it your way when it's ready." "Is it about justice again?" "Always," he said, then paused. "But this one's not about revenge. It's about what comes after." I smiled. "That's the better story." He chuckled. "You taught me that." Before we hung up, I said, "Noah, yeah, thank you. For everything. You don't thank family," he said. "You just call when the world starts spinning again." After the call, I walked outside. The air was crisp, almost sweet. The street was lined with vendors selling flowers, tulips, lilacs, roses. I stopped at one cart and bought a small bundle of lilies. The vendor wrapped them in brown paper and smiled. "For someone special," "Yes," I said. "For someone who survived." I took the flowers to the park, the same one where Daniel used to play as a boy. Children ran across the grass, their laughter ringing like bells. Near the fountain, I found a small patch of water, clear and shallow. I knelt and let one lily fall in. It floated gently, turning in slow circles before drifting away. "Goodbye," I whispered. Not to the Harpers, not even to the past, but to the version of myself who thought silence was safety. When I came home, Daniel was practicing guitar. Claire sat beside him, humming along. I stood at the doorway listening. The music was light, unfinished, beautiful. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I made tea for us both. Daniel sat by the window, the city glowing behind him. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked. "Nothing's ever over," I said. "But the worst part is..." He nodded, and for a long time, we just sat in that soft evening quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. As night fell, I opened the window wider. The air carried the scent of rain again, the promise of something growing. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed. I closed my eyes and listened. It didn't sound like morning anymore. It sounded like beginning. I turned to Daniel. "Do you hear that?" He smiled. "Yeah. It's beautiful. Remember it," I said. "That's what freedom sounds like." He reached over and took my hand. We sat there in the fading light, mother and son, survivors and witnesses to our own resurrection. And for the first time, I didn't think about the Harpers, the lake, or even the pain. I thought about tomorrow, ordinary, uncertain, alive. When Daniel went to bed, I stayed up a little longer. I turned on the small lamp by the bookshelf and looked around the apartment. The shadows were soft now, not hiding anything. On the table sat the finished notebook, the pages heavy with truth. I wrote one last line beneath all the others: "Some stories end not with vengeance, but with a mother's promise kept." I closed it and placed it on the shelf. Then I went to the window one last time. The city shimmered with 1,000 small lights, each one a quiet heartbeat against the dark. I thought of every woman who had ever been told to stay silent, to endure, to wait for someone else to make things right. And I wished they could all see this, the proof that even silence when broken can sound like music. I smiled, whispered to the night, "It's your turn now. If you've stayed with me to the end of this story, thank you. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? Do you believe justice can heal? Or does healing begin only after justice is done?" I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories, your reflections, they remind me that we're never truly alone. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories about strength, truth, and second chances. And tell me where you're listening from. I read every message. Until next time, keep your heart open, your voice steady, and your light unbroken. This was Eleanor's story. But perhaps in some way it was yours too.